Hello, hello, this is Redhawk, and I'm here with Mary Anne, and we're hanging at the deep end. And I want to thank you all for your questions. Today we're going to deal with some questions that I got from a buddy I started journeying with back in the early 70s. He'd gotten kicked out of the Navy, I got kicked out of the Coast Guard, and we just started hanging together, had a commune together, had an alleged band together, and got in trouble together, went to school together, and the whole time we were talking about WTF. We were just Wonder Brothers, what we were. We wondered together at all kinds of ways. So he sent me, he's one of our listeners now, and he's down in Florida. So, hey, Bob Hayes, thank you for your questions, and you have been hanging at the deep end all these years, I know. So today we're going to deal with these questions, and if you have questions, please let us know. Send them to redhawkthedeepend@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. So welcome to this quest that is the deep end. You know, I think that humans are the quest being. We are the ones who we just can't leave what it is alone. We have to ask the next question. And it always seems that's the way. And if you're not in a questionable state of mind in these days in this country called America, and it's 2018 for those of you in the future who have found these podcasts, we're in the middle of a turning, if you will, a pivot point. And the way that we are in the world is a condition of the way we think. And so the biggest threat to the human family right now is the way we think. So how do we change the way we think? I don't know about you, but I have a hard time changing even the littlest bit of a thing in my thinking.
Well, and I think that's the key right there. It's you got to change it a little bit at a time, because small shifts can make huge rifts.
That's right. At the same time, we know that there are these huge shifts that do occur. The civil rights in my life was a huge shift in thinking. I remember Johnson being on TV after all the protests, and Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam, and when he came back, he said, we've been fed a bunch of lies. And I remember Johnson saying, if we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost America. And so there are these huge shifts of thinking, and I'm hoping, having studied a little bit about wave theory and how a wave breaks, that it builds in increments and till it finally gets to that point where the wave breaks and you have a perfect curl to shoot the tube in as we surf this time frame called 2018.
Exactly, and I think that breaking is coming, and I think that we needed to be making these small shifts to be able to ride that wave, because that's what's happening. We
are creating the wave.
Right.
And that's important for us to remember, and we're all going to crash, man. But here's the thing. Got to be a good surfer. That's the whole thing about the quest and the journey and living a bit of an examined life, is you get to learn to surf. So as the time happens, as the spirit of the time builds, one is also able to, if you will, ride it in some ways that are amazing, interpret it. And that's what we're trying to do. This is a time of profound interpretation. So should we get on with it?
Sure. I was kind of liking the metaphor of the surfer, though.
Yeah,
in the ocean, because I think what can happen, too, is if we have our back to the wave, we have our back to the ocean, everybody knows you don't turn your back to the ocean. So we need to be aware, and that's where that shift in thinking comes in.
And yet you can't ride the wave unless you do turn your back to the ocean. You got to become one with it. So there's a moment where you have to shift your awareness, and I wonder if that's not where we are and how we do that.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's been one of my metaphors. I was a wannabe surfer as a kid and actually went surfing a few times and loved it. I sucked. And have surfed a few times since then and actually got up and had a good time, but realized it's not as easy as those blokes make it look out to be. And so when I got my British thing on today, I guess I do. So
channeling the Brits.
Yeah, channeling the Brits. let's go ahead and talk about some questions. And these are good ones. They're ones that we could dedicate a whole podcast to each of them. So, why do humans choose complex answers when all religions and philosophies are simple, as in the Golden Rule, at their most basic? We seem to thrive on complicated rules like food, taboos, clothing rules, special vocabularies. I know you've covered much of this in discussions of institutions, but there must be a way to cut through the chaff. Yeah. I think it's important for us to realize that we human beings are complexifiers. We're doing what the universe does. The universe is complexifying. The pieces don't just dance with each other, but when they dance with each other, they make something more complex, and it gets more complex. And each of us are a conglomeration of the complexities dancing. If you look at the whole way being turned into life, turned into consciousness, and we're here having this conversation. So it's the very process that we're talking about. It's our nature, and it's not only our nature, it's the nature of everything. To me, the whole issue is how can we, within this context, create a story where the complexities and all these little pieces make sense. For instance, food rules. I mean, you can see how those emerged. Somebody who was allergic to a nut ate a nut and they swelled up and died. And someone said, that's not kosher. Or they ate, shellfish. That's one of the rules. You don't eat shellfish in a kosher meal. Why? Well, someone probably was allergic, and they said, that's not kosher because it'll kill you. We didn't know who it would kill and who it wouldn't. We didn't have ways to respond to it. So a lot of it comes from responses to situations. For instance, love can't really be instituted. Okay, because it's a changing thing, right? Life's a moving target, if you will, and love is this thing that's trying to keep it in sight and find new ways to express itself within the context of the spirit of our times. And yet, we've created all these rules about love because along the way, certain things worked. She's giving me an eye of derision.
Well, I was just going to say, when you're talking about those food rules, tie that. What does that have to do with love? It has nothing to do with love, other than you.
Well, if you love something, you keep them alive, right?
Yes.
And if something's killing you, if one of your child dies, you go to the leader and say, "Hey, my child ate this food and it killed them," and you're grieving, and the whole community grieves, and so they make a rule. So it can be an expression of love, and I think it originally was.
Originally, right. And so I think part of that is, okay, we should have evolved beyond that because there are definitely people that can eat those things and not die. And so why do we still demonize them, even though, or for their lifestyle or whatever?
Well, and many of us are evolving beyond that. I mean, I know good Jews who keep two kitchens. One is a kosher kitchen and one is not. And, it depends on what's going on in their home. And so even in an Orthodox situation or a semi-Orthodox in that situation, there's, people want to honor their traditions.
Right. We get into the traditions and the reason for those.
Yeah. And it really is when do the traditions become dogma and thus unhealthy? When do they hold us back? And I think, with the whole thing, with data, now we're into metadata. We're beginning to see how data is used and how it compiles upon itself. And now with Facebook stuff, we're beginning to see the limitations of that and some of the weaknesses of it. And we're trying to respond to those. And those responses will become regulations. But up the road, those regulations may no longer apply. And I could suggest the Second Amendment might be one of those regulations that no longer apply. And we could do 20 shows on that. But I think the whole issue for this is we choose complex answers because we are complex beings and it's our nature. Now, I think we can modulate that, and that's part of what we're evolving to, is we're beginning to evolve, and the uncertainty principle is a classic example of how we look at something is going to depend on the results. And we're beginning, the whole thing at Starbucks, the two black men who were just waiting for a friend before they ordered were arrested. Well, that's their policy, right? Yet the policy was really misused in an unconscious bias way. So if you look at the conversation that's going on about that, it's how do we respond to that now? How do we adjust that regulation, that policy? And how do we not just adjust it for Starbucks, but how do we start responding to the unconscious bias that's there culturally? And if you look at the neighborhood that it happened in, it's a gentrified neighborhood.
And on a societal level, there are a lot of complexities because there are a lot of personalities and there are a lot of different ways that people think. But I think at the crux of everything, it is simple. It's a choice. Even I can remember thinking that whenever I had to make a choice, there were things that I would agonize over for months and months. Should I do this? Should I do that? Weigh it all out and then finally make that decision and move on. And looking back, it's like that was the only decision I really could make, because if I looked at all of my past, my upbringing, the influences, the things that came into my worldview, I was making decisions based on my experiences. I thought it was complex. And I think that gets back into what we were talking about too, is being in touch with God or with the one or the underlying love or power of the universe. And you either choose to be in touch with that or you choose to be out of touch with that. And I think that's our only choice. And so that does make it simple. But you're right about the complexity that we have to take that into.
Well, and we have to go through those constellations of considerations before we get to the simple answer. I mean, it doesn't seem simple at the time when you're in it, but when you look back, it does because of what the turning created. Well, my view, we make things complex because we're complex, and that's the nature of everything. I mean, seriously, everything gets more complex. How we do it and how we create feedback loops to modulate that so that it does not hold us back and create dogmas, those are side issues that I hope, as Mary Anne talked about, evolving past those pieces that create those dogmas. So question number two. Why does hate seem to have such a strong grip even when we say we believe in love your neighbor? Does hate make us feel better? It seems so ironic that members of most hate groups believe they are religious. How can we enhance our empathy so we avoid hate as our default when we encounter others? The biggest word that sticks out in that whole question is empathy. If you go to RSA Animate, I'm very serious, rsaanimate.com, and there's a number of little talks on there. They're 8 to 10 minutes. It's called 21st Century Enlightenment. And it says the biggest progressive mistake is thinking education is going to create the solutions. Education will not create the solutions, especially in the 21st century. Education has to be accompanied by empathy. And how do we teach empathy? There are ways to do that. There are group processes, especially for young people. We did this when I was hooked into the church in summer camps, where children would have group process to understand the haves and have-nots, the whole concept of poverty. My wife would create poverty villages out of our youth group so they could see how people in refugee camps lived. There are a whole number of ways to create empathy. Now, why is hate easy? Well, it's very easy right now because fear is so abundant. And what has happened in our time, and you can see this with Fox News and a lot of the proliferation of these websites that are hate websites, fear has become institutionalized. And once fear is institutionalized, like the condensation of the morning dew. What is condensing is hate. It's basically creating an us and them kind of situation. And it's very easy to demonize the other, and thus you create impediments to empathy. And you literally, in a biblical sense, create blindness. And we're in a very blinding time right now. Wouldn't you say that, Mary Anne?
I definitely would. Yeah, and I think hate accentuates the division between us and them, and doing that, it gives us a sense of false security, because then we have others that think like us, and we have an enemy to fight against.
Yeah.
And it's yeah.
And to be honest, there is an enemy to fight against. And the people who are part of the process of hate are missing what the real enemy is. A friend of mine, David Pryor, hey Dave, if you listen, I somehow don't think he's listening, but he wrote on Facebook about, Redhawk, how did this happen to us? And I wrote, I hate to say it, but I must have been blind to the growing rot that was infecting us. There are many who are not able to move forward, and their fear has become institutionalized and has festered into a new form of hate. It is a new turning in the unowned darkness now personified in the person of Donald Trump. Mythically, it is really a great illustration of the consequences of cutting ourselves off from our unconscious regions through the wonders of rational thought. You see, rational thought has cut us off from the part of us that is unowned and unseen, and we used to get reflections and pieces of this through stories, these mythic stories, through paintings and theater, and we're starting to do that again and creating a new mythic field. But at the same time, we've been cut off. So what happens, this darkness condenses, and it has actually been personified. And I'm convinced that Donald Trump is a personification of a shadow character of America. It's who we are, and that's difficult for me to own because I'm a patriot, and I go, ooh, icky, that's us?
Yeah, and what is it about that feeling that you get when you hate something, that what is being fed? And I think that's why do we choose that over love?
Well, what's happening is within that, they're not choosing it over love. They are choosing love. I was at a Church of Christ. They don't have musical instruments or any of that stuff. And the guy had a blackboard up there, and he drew a circle, and he said, if you're in this church today, you're going to heaven. But if you're outside, you are going to hell. And it's within that circle that they have gotten this. It's kind of like an ingrown hair. It's an interned love against itself, or love against the world, not understanding. And what happens is these people are afraid, and it's a way to belong.
But that's an aberration of love.
But we absolutely, there's
right.
No denying that. But my point is, it's a logical consequence if you look at Jungian psychology and Greek theater, how the unconscious forces gather and actually do puncture through into space-time reality as forces. And there is a force that has been released, and it's been institutionalized, and we can see it now. Now, what do we do about it in a free society? Well, a free society creates its own risks, and in those risks, we have to find some way of limiting them and becoming secure without limiting our freedom or dampening the equality of opportunity that we're reaching for.
And fear is the enemy of freedom.
Fear is the enemy of freedom. So, to me, I'll go to one more thing, and that's Hindu philosophy of, when we're doing hate, you're basically getting real tribal. And again, it's about belonging. There's a lot of people, a friend of mine here in town, I can't remember his name. I feel bad I can't because it's a powerful quote. He said, trauma is getting kicked out of belonging. So for me, this fear that is now institutionalized as hate is being created by a lot of people in trauma, what I call mythical trauma, because the new myths make no sense to them as they come on the mindscape, and the old myths can't bear the weight of our time. And so it's a very difficult place. They've banded together at least to belong to something. And that's my compassionate and loving response to something that's not easy for me to be compassionate and loving about.
Well, and it's also a real strengthening of the ego. And it's feeding that part of you that knows, that certainty, the ego, that groups together, and you're right, creates this force out
That's
into
right.
the universe.
But so does all belonging is good for the ego. It creates ego. So you can say that about the good side. It's part of the nature of it. It's just the ego is being identified with dark forces, and they don't see that it's dark forces, where our egos prayerfully are trying to at least identify with the forces of the light and move in that direction. But I'm going to suggest that any real sense of belonging creates ego strength. And there's a number of psychologies that I could go to on that. We could do a whole show on that one.
Well, the whole belonging, though, and I think without and it goes back to empathy, belonging with empathy, because then there isn't an other. When you have belonging as all of us in this together, rather than my group in this together, that is against everyone else. I think there's a distinction there.
Well, and there's also a judgment in that, yes, but those folks feel empathy for each other, and they don't feel we're worthy of it because we don't get it. And I get them not getting it. I see what that blindness is, maybe because I was a Southern boy who thought the South would rise again, and I was inside some of that. And I remember my waking moments that brought me out of it. But within that, it is loving and it is empathic. The tragedy is their empath has collapsed upon itself, and it can't reach outside the circle, so that it no longer feels that for people who aren't members of their tribe. And that again is the first chakra, which is tribal, and it's the most basic, and it's the one that is the last one to give out. It's the first one to show up and the last one to give out as our energy falls back into itself.
Well, there needs to be an increasing of the tribe.
Now we're back to the global narrative.
Right.
What creates the tribe? It's our stories, it's our narratives, and the more our narratives become the human narrative and the less an American or a Russian or a Chinese narrative, the more we will be able to walk in each other's shoes. And now we come to the third question. Given that self-concept is central to the mental functioning of humans, and given that an individual's self-concept is unique, based on nature and nurture, how do the new myths become more universal so they can reach more people and help them evolve more healthy self-concepts? How can we help people translate the new myths? Well, wasn't that a great conversation that we had that segued into that question? It gets back to the stories we tell. I go to Avatar because it's just such a loud, the whole backstory of Avatar that is showing itself as a shadow being amongst these organic people. And believe me, the earthlings who are in that are the Donald Trump people. You see what I'm saying? They're exploiting for their own self-worth. It's a wonderful metaphor. It's a wonderful mythic context for our time, and it tells the story of Earth people, and that's what we're looking for. I quoted from Keiku's book on the future last week about what are the roots of violence, and that conversation came out of talking about a global civilization. How do we create a global civilization in the 21st century? And again, go to rsaanimate.com. Education and empathy. Education and empathy. We have to create that. Education can no longer be me by myself. It has to be within group context, within interdependent learning. There's whole new models of education that are right on the edge trying to break in. And we see that the old education system, that institution, go back to our institution show, that institution is deconstructing like all the others. So what's happening on the other side of that? Well, education and empathy, news stories. You know, a guy set up a card table on a corner in New York City and said, I would like to listen to your story for 3 minutes. The line to sit in that chair went all the way down the block, around the corner, and halfway around the block. And it stayed that way until they put a sign on the last guy, said, I'm the last guy. For hours, most of the day, people are dying to tell their stories. Gather together. Tell your stories to each other. They will add up to the human experience. A human experience. You know those rich people who can take you to dinner and drop $1,000 on a dinner? Well, she's got cancer. You know, they might have a child who they've lost. We don't know. You see what I'm saying? We're all in this together, no matter where you are socioeconomically. I'm watching the series on the Kennedys. Whoa, talk about a tragic family. I mean, geez, I wouldn't want to be born into that family. I feel like fate had a target right on my heart.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
But you see what I'm saying in
Right.
that? It's you can't classify this. You can't turn it into just a class struggle, although the whole fight for equal opportunity is a class struggle at this point, regrettably.
Well, that's a different issue than are we all the same regardless of our economic status? Yes, we are.
And that's the source of the new myth. Again, I would invite you to read the last part of the last chapter of A Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's amazing. It just lays it at our feet. So let's go to the fourth question. Well, we still have a little bit of time. I'm going to mispronounce some words here. Bob, you are truly an academic. Related to the above, we're all on unique paths. How do we keep our paths in the Tao? Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, in his book Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, discusses how there are many types of optimal experience he calls flow. These include mystical experience, sports experience, scientific breakthroughs, chess matches, etc., etc. Basically, he says there are two forces that create flow when balanced, and that's challenge and expertise. The challenge and the ability to rise to it, if you will. Is this being in the Tao? I don't know. I'll start with that before I dance around it. The Tao is an interesting thing, the movement of everything, including the spirit of our times and all the interpretations. And how do we move with that? How do we create a path of least resistance that will make the deepest mark in our own time? That's a very interesting paradox of being, if you will. I think the whole concept of flow, we talked about, becoming your own dharma. Other studies on this flow state, if you will, is, your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down, the 4 quadrants of your brain go into sync. A whole series of things happen. When I used to perform a lot, I felt like I would get up on stage, and the next thing I knew, I was leaving, and I went, "Whoa, was I up here an hour?" I mean, it wasn't. I wasn't even there. I was in a different place.
Yeah, and I think we've all had those experiences.
I pray so.
But they come and they go.
Yes.
And so, is our task to live in that space and to be there, and is it possible to do that?
No.
I think that present moment that Eckhart Tolle talked about, the being here now. Well, who was the other guy? Anyway, that whole idea of being in the moment and not noticing the moment passing, because that's what you're talking about. You're on stage and you're in that flow, you're in the groove, You're doing it, and you don't notice that time has elapsed.
Skiing was the same thing when I used to ski and I was by myself. I don't think we ever get in it, and I've used this model before, but I think we oscillate in and out of it at a quicker rate the more we move with the Tao. And you know, some people, I think some people can go years and they'll have a moment and they'll, you know, and they'll want more of it. It's an amazing event that people miss because of their preconceptions, their own inability to play and wonder, that lets one out of the constrictions of their own mind. You know, I always say people are walking around in a world where everything can be explained, and that's the biggest bunch of crap in the whole world, because nothing can be explained, you know. I mean, I can tell you how everything works and how it got here, but I can't tell you why or, you know, the deeper part of it. And every scientist who's doing their work at the deepest level, or her work, excuse me, is basically wondering. So
well, and there's that focus piece too.
Yes.
When you focus in on something and the rest of the distractions, everything else goes away.
Yes. So 2 things here. One, we must create some internal measure, some metric within ourselves of when we are not in that space.
You mean like 24/7?
Well, and you know how
that was facetious.
I know, but I'm with you. And the whole, to me, it's like, how many times a day do I have to stop and say, take a deep breath? And that's me going, I'm not moving in the flow of it. Now, the second thing is, because that internal metric, it takes a lot of work to do that. You have to be willing to self-examine
and practice.
And practice, exactly. The second piece is huge. And Bob, in this Mihaly's piece, he says the flow is a balance between challenge and expertise. I meet so many people who I feel their hunger for knowledge, but they want to get it by watching TV. If you don't read, you're never going to get it. All I can say is there's no way. There's no TV. There's no DVD or program. I love National Geo. I've learned more about the beaver and the birds and a lot of these things. But there's something about the associations and the connections made in reading that cannot be done in the same way. And it has to do with your imagination. We used to call it book world. You know, right. It's like Edie would say, Redhawk, can I get you out of book world for a minute? And it was like, give me a second. You know, it's like coming out of a meditation. Don't be too fast. You know, how deep am I in this other world? And it's a world that's created in your head that is so healthy. And when you're watching a Disney piece, there's nothing in your head. That's Disney's head. That's a whole institution's head. And I'm all for it. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for it. I've watched them all. Well, not all of them, but I'm almost up to speed.
Well, because movies can tell a story.
Yeah, and they're important.
Very well, right.
But it's a multifaceted thing. You must be educated. You must be. And I'll be honest, with community college and the YMCA and all the classes that are offered, everybody can find time to take a class somewhere if you're not of that place yet. You know, start getting your feet wet. But if you want to face the challenge of these times in a full way, then you have to read. Now, I always thought I had to read a bunch of stuff. Like, you know, I took The Economist for a couple years. As much as I talk, I can't think in that small a font. I just can't. Well, I don't know if we've responded all the way. I've got one more question. Let's see. Do we have time to?
Well, let me just say one thing about the whole flow idea. And it seems like that you have to have challenge and expertise, but it can't be too hard and it can't be not hard enough. And so, what I think of is the Buddhist middle way. You know, It's once you can find that place where you are challenged enough and you're educated enough, but yet it's not too easy, because then you get out.
Well, there's the old Peter principle, which people get promoted one promotion past their level of competence. You're so competent, you get promoted into a position, and you never find competency there because it's past your ability of expertise and your ability to really engage, and that's important to realize. But it's also important to not, accept a challenge that maybe you're not ready for. And when I was young, I did that a number of times, and they were great teachers. But part of what I learned was those were challenges I wasn't ready for.
Well, but it's an opportunity to learn, to grow, though.
Yes.
Too. So
and
there's a fine line.
Yeah, and that it's riding that fine line that creates the metric that allows you to self-reflect and have a sense of the edge, if you will, of being on and off in the Tao or in and out of the Tao. And I think that's important. There's more questions, and we're going to respond to those. Actually, I can try to unfold those in our next podcast. Any final comments, Mary Anne?
No, I think we've said enough.
Yeah, and I don't want to go too far over. Next week we're gonna go somewhere that is quite amazing, because we're all stuck there. What am I talking about? Where am I talking about? How am I talking about it? Well, let me ask you, have you ever set a metric for yourself that was way beyond your ability? We've been talking about that. Have you ever woken up in the middle of that and realized, oh my gosh, I am so imperfect? And just, I'm a good neurotic. I can really beat myself up on how imperfect I am. But wait a minute. Is my view of perfection imperfect? And if my view of perfection is imperfect, then how am I living up to or down to my own image of perfection? Wait a minute, now I'm confused. Am I in an elevator with mirrors on all sides, and everywhere I look it shoots to infinity? How do I grab hold of this? How do I look at that edge in me that is it's definitely not perfect? What do I do with that? Do I just jump into the deep end and just fall? Hell yeah, good idea. Because here's the thing about the deep end. If you're honest, if you really look at yourself, as you fall, you'll grow wings. And that's part of our motto here. Fall, grow wings. Join us for imperfection, and join us in this God's peace that we bless on all of you.